It's the most upscale restaurant.
I didn't know that, but still, you know, they treated us very nicely. They gave us the worst seats in the house. It was very clear. Rabbi.
I never found them out. I did a couple of different people. I know people were actually there.
I'm Jon Salmon, and this is my much older brother Henry Salmon.
I'm the funny one.
But you're grayer.
80 years ago, 80 years ago, on November 9th and 10th, 1938, a Nazi-coordinated attack of anti-Semitic destruction and murder swept across Germany, Austria, and part of Czechoslovakia. Less well known, this is also the 80th anniversary of the song God Bless America, sung for the first time on November 11, 1938, the first Federal Veterans Day, then called Armistice Day. It was written by the Jewish composer, who we know as Irving Berlin, who fled Russia as a 5-year-old child. Originally written in 1918, Berlin waited to release his song until it was most needed, as a response to Kristallnacht. In 1940, the KKK called it a song reflecting the refugee hordes. It became part of the movement against the anti-Semitism, hate, and prejudice unleashed by the rise of Nazism in Europe and the United States. Thankfully, we still have with us an eyewitness to this tragedy, our father, Egon J. Salmon. Tonight, we gather for the 3rd annual Egon J. Salmon and Family Commemoration of Kristallnacht and the St. Louis. More than 267 synagogues were burned down, 91 Jews killed, and 30,000 Jewish men arrested, including my grandfather Paul, our grandfather Paul, whose shop windows were among the thousands shattered. This wave of violence was accompanied by the loss of rights of Jewish citizens. As Jews attempted to flee, as they became refugees, very few nations were willing to take them in. America's efforts to rescue 20,000 youth, the Wagner-Rogers bill, failed due to a lack of support for immigrants. Canada also refused the Jewish refugees who sought to flee Nazi Europe. And today, November 7th, 2018, today, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau issued a formal apology in Parliament to six of the passengers of the St. Louis, which was known as the Voyage of the Damned. Sadly, after 80 years, this atmosphere of hate and its lessons still are not only relevant, but continue to be sprawled across our headlines. But so are the interfaith efforts and passion that are part of our blessed community. We are pleased to welcome here tonight representatives of major Jewish, Christian, and Muslim organizations, as well as students, who we hope will ensure this next generation learns from the mistakes of the past. I invite Dr. Carin Guarasci, did I say it right?
Yes.
No, okay. I was practicing it. Of Wagner College to say a few words to welcome to begin our commemoration.
Thank you. It's very touching. Is this on? To be here tonight and see such an overwhelming response to a very important issue. I think it was 2 weeks ago I was here for a book discussion on Americana, and just this time span of 1938 to 1941 and flees in Jewish Italians fleeing Italy. And of course, since that time, we've had the incident at the Pittsburgh Synagogue and bombs being sent out. So this is a time that we really need to learn from the lessons of the past and not be so, treat one another with such hatred, but with more generosity and be gentle with each other. I'm here because my husband, Richard Guarasci, is away presenting at a conference in Virginia. And that conference is on civic engagement. And we are heading towards the end of our time here. Richard and I have been here for 22 years, and it is time for us to leave. But one of the most wonderful accomplishments of this administration is the involvement in the community. And we love so many people from the community that you know that it is a mixed feeling for us to be leaving. It's time for us to leave, but we also take with you the love that you have for us and the love we have for you. And I've been asked to read something today. Wagner College is grateful to be able to host the 3rd annual Egon J. Salmon Commemoration of Kristallnacht and the St. Louis. We are proud of the partnership with diverse faith communities in New York. Our partnership with the Jewish community dates back to the 1930s, when, and this was new to me also, as we learned from the archives, Wagner College and the JCC were able to end preaching the words of anti-Semitism by a Lutheran pastor on Staten Island. Wagner students every day go out into the Staten Island community to make a difference to immigrants, refugees, and many others. Thank you for coming tonight and for being a part of the effort to make our community stronger and to stand up against the hate through Holocaust education. It is now needed more than ever. Thank you.
Thanks, Carin. Welcome and good evening. My name is Victor Avis, and with my wife, Kim, we are co-chairs. Hi, Kim. We're co-chairs of the High Society, which was a society that was formed 12 years ago, and really so proud and so moved by this evening. When it was begun 12 years ago with the Guarasci's family and Devorah Lieberman's Wagner leadership, and leadership from people like my father and Alan Weissglass and the Bloomfields, with a vision that Wagner College should be a more welcoming place for potential students of Jewish faith to apply and matriculate, because it wasn't very welcoming back then. And so to see us 12 years later with a room nearly filled to commemorate the Salmon's experience, it integrates the best of Wagner. I mean, it's community involvement, it's acknowledging a very important family on Staten Island, and it's acknowledging an event that, as so many will allude to tonight, has never been more timely. And the High Society has morphed. We began with a humble thought that if we created a Hillel and we created Jewish scholarships, that we could attract more Jewish students to Wagner. And that has worked remarkably well. And as Alan Weissglass said to me once, he says, well, now what are you going to do? And what we did is we developed this Wagner Holocaust Center, which is, I guess, 3 years, 4 years into its programming. And the center has reached over 3,000 students, mostly on Staten Island, where it has involved bringing Holocaust survivors to the classroom. And typically a Wagner student will go, and having worked through with the middle school faculty, the first part one of 3 parts, and then the second visit is with a Holocaust survivor, and then the third visit is a debriefing led by the Wagner student. And this has had a significant impact, we know, on Staten Island, and educating more students of different faiths about the Holocaust. And so we continue with programming like this, with programming in the community to expand the message so that we can share. And as the events in Pittsburgh and events in politics continue, we realize that education is a significant part of not only not forgetting, but making sure it doesn't happen again. I never thought 12 years ago that I would be as concerned as I am these days. And so I acknowledge Carin, yours and Richard's vision to support this effort. I acknowledge our wonderful Staten Island community for coming up on the Hill to a place that we weren't really welcome and saying, hey, we could make a change here. And then I'm so glad to be able to join the Salmon family in remembering this event. So welcome. And I'm now going to introduce Professor Laura Morowitz and Professor Zagorin to come up and begin the programming for the evening. Thank you.
I need support. Good evening. I would like to first start by asking Malka Katzman of Chabad of Staten Island to join us. Her and her husband were very grateful, and they're here tonight. And she will be playing two very meaningful songs on the violin. She will start with Ani Mayamin, and then she will play a song called Oyfn Pripetshik. And we will continue with the lighting ceremony. To call the Egon Salmon family to light the first candle.
Come on, take it.
And I would like to call to light the second candle, the first generation survivors, Brenda Perlman and Arthur Spielman, who survived in hiding, and Elena Reichman. Ronald Dronovic. If there are any other first-generation survivors in the room, please step down to light the candle. Leah, you-
One that's for all of us.
Now I would like to call the second generation survivors, Vera Sullivan, whose parents were in St. Louis, Frank Wiley, whose parents survived Auschwitz, Rachel Reichman Mauer, Manny Sachs, Beth Siegel-Griff, and Harry Siegel. Rabbi Stern, Linda Hirschfeld, Beth Nevens, Shally Shore, and Fern Zagor. Is Rabbi Sassman here?
We'll move in.
Everyone behind the second generation. Everyone behind the table.
For candle number 4, I would like to call the Jewish community representative, David Sorkin from the JCC, Scott Mauer from COJO, the Council for Jewish Organization, Amy Posner of CSI Hillel, and Rabbi Havel. High Society board members, Marcia Klein, Dennis and Elaine Blomfield, Kim and Victor Avis, and Phil Strineri.
Are we all here? Hi, Phil. Nice job, Phil.
For candle number 6, I would like to invite Wagner students, Deja Harris Holmes, Abigail Dorson, Ijoma Wobu, and alumni Jennifer Wiley and Teresa Reed.
You're our future.
So before we listen to another beautiful song on the violin, I would like to ask Rabbi Mendy Katzman of Chabad to say a few words about the symbolism of this music and the Holocaust.
The haunting melody of Ani Mamin that was just played before, a song of faith, was composed on the train to Treblinka. One man began singing it in a still, quiet voice, and then the rest of the train began singing the song in unison, over and over, expressing their faith in the face of death. A young boy managed to escape the train and bring the song to the Madisa Rebbe, who, deeply moved by this tune and its origins, declared, "With this tune they went to the gas chambers. With this tune, we will march to the final redemption." Even in the darkest of times, the Jewish people have always held on to their faith and traditions. Ani ma'amin, I believe.
Reminds me of my grandmother. Finally, I would like to ask Ruth Kupperberg, who is the president of Hillel here at Wagner, to light an extra candle in honor of 11 lives that were lost to anti-Semitism at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh.
Good evening. My name is Ruth Kupperberg, and I am the president of the Wagner College Hillel here on campus. We are heartbroken at an attack on the Jewish community of Pittsburgh this past 2 weeks. Yeah. This horrific attack appears to have been triggered in part by the participation of the Tree of Life Synagogue on the National Refugee Shabbat, organized by the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. Recently, Wagner College Holocaust Center, our Hillel, and the High Society proudly organized a Shabbat dinner as a part of this effort to promote dialogue about the challenges and rewards to welcoming refugees into our country. Now, last week, I had the privilege of sharing my own thoughts about the attack with the Wagner community, and it reads, we as students have to, we have the responsibility to rise up against the evils of anti-Semitism and do our part as a community to prevent any and all acts of hate that may appear on our campus. As Wagner students, we need to devote ourselves to condemning hateful speech that targets someone because of their religious beliefs, race, or gender, no matter how innocent it may seem. None of our friends or faculty should ever feel unsafe or unwelcome because of who they are or how they identify themselves. We as students have to understand that we must go a step further and devote ourselves to doing acts of kindness and good deeds wherever and however we can. I'm certain that all students will stand up against the event that took place in Pittsburgh and make a pledge to be leaders against any hate in our Wagner community. Now, we mourn the loss of these precious 11 lives and express our solidarity with the Jewish community of Pittsburgh and all Americans. In addition, we commit ourselves to action and positive change. A few suggestions that I could think would benefit us all are doing a mitzvah or a good deed in the memory of one of these victims, condemning any hateful speech that targets others because of their religious beliefs, race, gender, or other differences, or reaching out to others across cultural, religious, or political differences, and being able to learn from each other because of these differences. Let us all send our condolences and uplift those in pain with our thoughts and actions. Now, I am honored to introduce the video of Egon Salmon, whose life and testimony I studied in my history class a few years ago with the testimony of other Staten Island Holocaust survivors. His video is a reminder on this 80th anniversary of Kristallnacht of our responsibility to refugees, the theme of tonight's talk. Thank you.
It's very, very difficult to comprehend. It is almost impossible to describe because of restrictions to Jews where that they couldn't get into a restaurant, hotels, restricted to eat, what movie you can go to, who you can go out with. People didn't want to associate because they were afraid. It wasn't a question of not being able to get out of Germany. The problem was, where would you go to? Kristallnacht, my father was picked up by the Gestapo and put into a concentration camp in Dachau. He was there for approximately 5 weeks. The German government then decided to release all the Jewish people that were picked up and put in prison and sent home. Because of the happenings, my mother, my sister, and myself booked passage on a ship, the St. Louis. We left Germany to Cuba to be reunited with my father. Entering the harbor of Havana, Cuban government decided not to give permission for the passengers to disembark and had to leave to go back to Germany. Probably the last ship leaving Europe for the United States. We entered the United States in Hoboken, New Jersey, and took residence in Staten Island. I went to high school, Newdorp High School. I was drafted and sent to a basic training camp in Spartanburg, South Carolina. I served overseas in Africa and Italy, predominantly in the Italian campaign, until the end of war, 1945. I have 2 children, 2 boys. I have 6. No, wait a second. I have 4 granddaughters, 2 grandsons, and 4 great-grandchildren.
How do you think future generations can prevent this kind of thing from happening again?
Can't. Depends how people react, how people vote, what happened. Sorry, I bring tears to my eyes. You have to hope. It's a lesson which you're learning. You better learn it diligently. Study hard. Be a good citizen, so that you don't get locked up. But, yes, be a good citizen. So that's basically the story.
Thank you, Egon. Thank you, the Salmon family, for reminding us about our need to discuss the past so we can move forward into the future. Some of you may know that this film is part of a series that the Staten Island Advance is doing. And one of the high points will come at the end of this month when Wagner welcomes representatives of all 24 schools, middle and high schools on Staten Island, to study the 15 Holocaust survivor stories that Shira has created a series about, and that Wagner College students have been working on for 5 years with local students. So that will actually take place in this room on November 29th as part of this journey of studying our neighbors and asking our questions of what we can learn
from the stories of our neighbors. When we hear about the plight of refugee and immigrant children in World War II, we ask, what did they do? When we read in the media today about the plight of refugee and immigrant children, we wonder, what can we do? What must we do? The current global political situation is a reminder of the efforts in the Holocaust to rescue Jewish children, an effort that tragically largely failed. Over 1 million children were murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators in the streets of ghettos and in concentration camps. One effort at resistance was the difficult decision to place children in hiding. These hidden children did not face Nazi guards on a daily basis as in the ghettos and camps, but their daily lives were still filled with terror. As Arthur Spielman, who's here with us today and who will be speaking tomorrow to the Jewish Foundation School when they come for Kristallnacht to Wagner College Holocaust Center. Arthur Spielman, who hid in an orphanage in Hungary, has said, the worst aspect of Nazi persecution was the fear. If you dropped off your child at Hebrew school last week, as I did, and saw a police car stationed in front as a form of protection, you have only a small insight into what this type of fear of children hiding might have felt like. Our two speakers today are drawn from the world of journalism and community organizing. Rather than an academic perspective on the rise of anti-Semitism and its history, or of anti-immigrant sentiment or racism in America, they offer perspectives of those who have taken action to help others raise their voices. We have asked them to speak briefly to allow time for dialogue and discussion about addressing real-world problems today. Our first speaker is Jane Marks Hart. Jane is the author of the groundbreaking article in the New York Magazine that first explored the then-unknown subject of Jewish children in hiding during the Holocaust. They hid by the thousands in forests, in barns, in convents, or sleeping under floorboards or behind stoves. Jane's exploration of their pain and resilience and of the efforts of righteous Gentiles, be they Christian or Muslim, garnered praise from the eminent Holocaust historian Robert J. Lifton for, quote, her important contribution to Holocaust literature and the human future. Another reviewer wrote, regardless of our ethnic origins, we are reaching across the bridge of time. We are hiding, hurting, and escaping with them. Jane currently works as an art therapist in prisons and with at-risk youth. Jane's talk today will explore the trauma of being a child refugee on the run in hopes that it is relevant to us today. Among the 23 interviews in her book, one child wrote, quote, we were in plain sight, but hiding our Jewishness. Jane.
I'm very honored to be here tonight, and I've been moved by what I've heard. And it's always a pleasure for me to talk about the hidden children who mean so much to me. I wrote the book about 25 years ago, but they're still very present in my life, and some literally, some figuratively. The Holocaust ended 70 years ago, and much has been done to keep it from being forgotten or trivialized. There are museums and memorials in 27 countries, and Holocaust denial is a crime in many. Our own Holocaust Museum in Washington has had more than 30 million visitors from all over the world, including 8 million school children. So why do we need to make an effort to keep it alive and in conversation? Well, look what's going on around us. The internet is ablaze with anti-Semitism, even in Denmark, such a bastion of tolerance. What happened in Pittsburgh, of course, the dehumanizing of people, of other groups. And we have to ask ourselves in our own hearts, could we have been swept along on a tide of national self-righteousness, believing that if we just get rid of those people, everything would be fine? And if we didn't believe it, would we have the courage to resist and oppose what we knew was wrong, even when it might have been dangerous? How far would we have gone to protest what we felt was wrong? And what if we had been the victims? Would we have had the ingenuity and courage to survive, and then, years later, to process these unspeakable memories and once again embrace a life of joy and purpose. I think that one excellent place to examine those questions is the experiences of the hidden children. And I'm going to tell you one story from my book. It's dramatic. It's the shortest story I was told. I don't have that much time to talk. So I hope you will find something you can relate to in this. It was a little girl named Christine who was 7 or 8 years old, living with her parents and her little brother in the ghetto of Lvov. And there was a lot of activity of, kidnapping Jewish children, putting them in harm's way, and that was going on all the time. So Christine's father was always looking for places to hide the 2 children when the police would come. He made a space 3 feet long, 1 foot deep below the window to camouflage to look like the wall, and he put the children in there. And it was so short of air. Christine would be crying and begging, please don't put us in there, please don't put us in there. But it was how they survived. Then the parents went to work in a labor camp, so she was left alone with her little brother with instructions. If you hear footsteps, put them in the suitcase under the bed and you go hide in the closet. And she would have to do that. She would wait till the footsteps were gone and then go quickly get her brother before he suffocated. And then when she thought it couldn't get worse than that, she learned what she had to do next. Her father had dug a tunnel from the house next door, which was empty, down to the sewer. And one day when he broke through, he found himself face to face with a sewer worker. And he thought, that's it for me. But the sewer worker said, no, I won't report you. I will help you, but you have to give me everything you have. This is going to really cost. So father decided it's worth it. It's the only chance we have. So he gathered all their valuables, met this man the next day, and he said, okay, tonight's the night. And father tried to explain to Christine what she had to do, and she said, no, I can't do it. And there were some cars with soldiers coming close, so her father said, no, this is it. And she had to go down a very narrow tunnel. He said he'd go first, then Christine, then her brother Pavel, and then mother. She could hear the sound of water in the tunnel below, and she knew she couldn't do it. She sobbed, I don't want to go. Her father said gently but urgently, you have to. Trust me, don't worry. And she watched him go down, and then somebody pushed her, and she felt herself falling through blackness, and then her father caught her and put her on his back. He said, hold tight. She grabbed his neck and held on to his hips with her feet. He kept telling me to hold on. She was shaking and her teeth were chattering so hard she couldn't talk. Then her mother was behind her holding the baby. The walkway was narrow, and they had to be careful not to fall into the water. It seemed like they had to walk forever. She kept asking her father how much longer, and he said, just a few more minutes. It was especially frightening when they had to cross from one side of the river to the other. Meanwhile, all around, people were dropping down into the sewer through manholes. It was terrifying. And then suddenly her father's contact, whose name was Leopold Socha, appeared and took them with several others to a special tunnel where they wouldn't be seen. Mr. Socha told her father where to find boards to put across the flowing water where they could sleep. And by then, Christine was so tired, she fell asleep leaning on a strange man who said, you're little, but you're so heavy. They stayed there for a few days. Some people couldn't take the stench and the darkness, so they left. But 10 of them remained in the sewer for 14 months. During that time, they never went outside or saw daylight. They talked in a whisper, if at all. They lived with webs and moss hanging on the walls. And the river not only smelled terrible, but it was full of diseases. They all got dysentery, and Christine remembers her little brother, and she was so sick with unrelenting diarrhea. There was only enough clean water for half a cup a day per person. Christine's parents didn't take theirs. They gave it to the children so they wouldn't die from dehydration. Mr. Socha and 2 of his friends were faithful in bringing food, but there were dangers. A few times other sewer workers saw them, and they had to run to escape. They'd see the wet shoes hanging up or maybe hear a voice. And Christine said, I got so scared I stopped breathing, but we got away. Another time, their little stove lamp started a fire. They thought they'd be burned, but they survived that too. Then there was a heavy rainstorm, and the sewer swelled so that the water was almost up to the ceiling, which was less than 5 feet high. The parents, who were constantly bent, had to hold the children up high so they could breathe. They were always soaking wet. And then came the rats. The rats were all over them, each one about a foot long, but they weren't afraid. Christine said, we played with them. They were our toys and our pets. We fed them and they grew even bigger, eating our bread, but they always wanted more, and her father had to stay awake at night to keep the rats from eating all their food. All this time, nobody had to tell them to be quiet. Christine said she felt like an animal, ruled by instinct. She never spoke above a whisper. But after a few months of this, she got very, very depressed, and she stopped eating or talking. That was when Leopold Socha sensed that something was very wrong, and picked her up, and took her through the tunnels, and said, look up. And she saw a little bit of daylight. And he said, you have to be very brave. Someday you'll go up there and live a life like other children, but for now, just do what your father tells you. He brought books, Mr. Socha brought books so Christine could be taught to read. Her father would whisper the letters into her ear. And he figured she would need to be ready for school if they survived. And if they didn't survive, she would have been kept busy. From then on, Christine was just crazy about Mr. Socha, and she'd always wait for him. And he'd come every other day with food. First thing she'd see was his smile, which was radiant, a radiant smile with perfect teeth. He was a cheerful man and thoughtful. He managed to get Sabbath candles so her mother could have Shabbos in the sewer. And he would save part of his lunch always for Christine and her little brother. When liberation came, he was the one who came to tell them. They'd heard plenty of Russian bombs exploding nearby, but they didn't know they were free until he banged on the pipes. He called our names, she said, and said, you can come out now. But even after liberation, life was hard. The war was over, but anti-Semitism was not. Christine went to school, but the school principal, who was a nice lady, and her mother decided she had to use a fake name and pretend not to be Jewish because the children were tormenting her maliciously and writing Christine the Jew on the building. And when her mother took her for a little vacation, the owner of the boarding house said, Hitler made only one mistake. He didn't kill all the Jews. And there was no money at all. Her father had had his own business before this all started, but now they had no money at all. And he had to make her shoes out of newspaper with laces of string or rope. And he said, this way you can run to keep warm. They were very, very resourceful. And eventually, in the early 50s, they got to emigrate to Israel, and that was wonderful. She could finally relax and not worry about being a Jew among people who hated her. And she struggled to learn English and Hebrew so she could get through medical school, and she did it, and she became a dentist. And when I met her, by the way, she was wearing the most beautiful handmade shoes. And when I was writing the book, she called me one night and said, guess what I found last night? I said, what? She said, I found the sweater I was wearing the night we went into the sewer. And she said it was a little yellow and green sweater with short sleeves and a bow that her grandmother had made for her. And she said, you know, when I found it, I showed it to my son, who was then in high school. And he said, Roger, do you know what this is? And he said, oh, I don't know, Mom. It's, you know, maybe it's something the bugs ate, something falling apart. And she said, Roger, this is the sweater I was wearing the night we were running. And he was so taken aback. He said, but Mom, you were so little. He'd heard the story, unlike some hidden children who do not tell the stories to their families for fear of upsetting them or for fear of being seen in a vulnerable position. But she had. And she said, you know, maybe you can learn from this that life is not easy, but you can do anything you want if you put your mind to it. And she did share with me her special little secret, the way she got through her having to study 4 hours per page to learn a new language in her chemistry book, study with a dictionary. She said, I would pretend that I was in a concentration camp and there was a guard with a gun pointed at me, and unless I did what I had to do, I'd be killed. She had in her mind the image of her cousin, the day her cousin went into a camp, and the look on her face. And so that's how she got through. But today she is a beautiful woman, a very accomplished professional, and she is so kind. She can't stand fear on anyone's face. Once when she was a child, before they went into the sewer, one night she'd heard a gasp, and she looked out the window, and there was a Jewish man being beaten by teenagers with clubs, and he was begging them to stop, and they didn't stop, and they killed him, and she remembered seeing him there. And so she cannot see fear. She's known as the best dentist, because if she sees just the slightest bit of fear on anyone's face, she stops and waits till they gather themselves. So that's the story. The book is full of wonderful stories of courage, each one really a lesson in healing for the rest of us. It's not, that story is very dramatic in the experience itself, but equally dramatic are the things that happened right in the aftermath, when a happy ending was neither happy nor an ending for the children who'd been in hiding for so many reasons. And then the psychological baggage they took into their later years, their middle age, and then miraculously the healing that each one found. So, I mean, the stories are utterly different. And when I say that I hope you will read the book, feel, get it from a library, borrow it from a friend. If you want to buy it, it is still in print, and it's an ebook. It's available if you want immediate gratification to get it right now. I just feel that the stories are so important, and the youngest of the hip children are my age, 75, and we're not going to last forever. So there will come a time when it will be the stories that will tell the tale and not the people themselves. So I hope you will read it. I hope you'll share it with your children, your grandchildren, and friends of other faiths, because it's just too important to let go away. Thank you.
We'll take questions after both
sure.
speakers, but thank you for reminding us of the pain of being a child in the Holocaust, even among those who survived, and of reminding us that there were people like Mr. Soto, and that is the question that we're all asking ourselves about today. And so to speak about today, Rabbi Kaplan of the JCRC recommended Jonathan Soto, who is about to speak, who in 2015 was appointed by Mayor Bill de Blasio to serve as the senior community liaison for the first ever Mayor's Clergy Advisory Council. Is the microphone working?
Yeah.
Trained in law and urban planning, Jonathan was determined to see that communities of faith would have a larger voice in the formation of city policy. In 2017, Jonathan created and led the city's first Center for Faith and Community Partnerships, and building on his experience with Hurricane Sandy and in response to Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, he deployed 150 New York City employees to aid local municipalities in 2017. Jonathan received his BA from Fordham University and JD from Brooklyn Law School, and currently serves as the Associate Vice President of Strategic Initiatives at Union Theological Seminary, a place that has its own special history. Jonathan will speak to us today about the landscape of the New York City refugee and the long-term commitment of UTS and other faith-based groups to refugees. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lori, for that kind introduction and for this fantastic center that is able to bring such an amazing multiplicity of experiences and culture and ages to be able to do something that is sacred. And that if we don't remember the sacredness of what we call our embodied solidarity, especially in times where it looks like the fabric of our bodies are being torn apart, To have a center here in Staten Island is key, and I want to thank you for your efforts. And also to the Salmon family, I'm honored to be able to be in your presence and to be able to partake in this special moment with you and to the community at large. My time at the mayor's office was pretty wild, especially after last year, or the last 2 years, when we saw several different crises throughout the city really emerge. And I want to talk briefly about 3 key experiences that showed me the value of the Jewish community, and not only the resilience but the embodied solidarity that makes the city great. We have over 1 million Jews here in New York City, the most in the country, and outside of Israel, I believe, in the world. And New York City's resilience, its commitment to solidarity is embodied by the community, especially in the dark times that we saw as it related to refugees, as it related to immigrants, and as it related to individuals that in the last couple of months have found themselves challenged by what we saw. And it started with what we saw in activation after the travel ban. A whole group of individuals at the airports, very confused, not able to enter into this space and into this place, especially when they were fleeing persecution throughout the world. And immediately after that ban was instituted, I received calls from synagogues and Jewish leaders throughout the city saying, Jonathan, we want to go now to JFK. We want to support the individuals that are standing for the rights. We want to bring our lawyers and our legal teams to be able to ensure that what happened to us and the exclusion that happened to us does not happen to our fellow human beings that are at JFK. And it was fascinating to see the outpouring of support, to see the outpouring of engagement that was not only short-term, but extended beyond that crisis to the crisis that we saw with family separation that happened recently, where we had individuals throughout the city opening up their synagogues, willing to take in children that were being placed specifically at the Cayuga Center in East Harlem. This was a recent dynamic where we saw children separated from their parents here in New York City, over 500 of them. And the first calls that we would receive time and time again were from our Jewish sisters and brothers throughout the synagogue saying, we want to be able to provide services and support. Not only do we want to provide services and support, but we want to be able to engage in direct action to create networks, not only for fundraising, networks to be able to house individuals in our spaces. Many synagogues became sanctuary spaces in order to highlight the protective nature of the faith communities, especially as we saw individuals fleeing from persecution, and especially here in New York City, which New York City truly is the diaspora capital of the world. And every single time we see a crisis throughout the world, we see a community that activates, a community that emerges here, trying to ask for assistance and help, and the first individuals that are always there to assist are our Jewish sisters and brothers. And now we are seeing that with legislative advocacy, we are working now at Union Seminary and in collaboration with the mayor's office on what is called the SCAR Act. The SCAR Act, the Separation of Children and Accountability Response Act, which requires that nonprofits and organizations that are holding children that have been separated, that are considered refugees at this time and at this moment, are able to publicly work with nonprofits, community organizations, and open up relationships with synagogues and houses of worship throughout the city to ensure that children are visited, that children have the resources that they need, and that this collaboration and this, I say, synthesis of embodiment really creates a solidarity that in the last couple of years is something that should serve as a model for interfaith and multi-faith engagement. And it is interesting to be here at this day, especially after the tragedy at Tree of Life Synagogue, understanding that as anti-Semitism is on the rise, we need to be in embodied and direct solidarity across cultures, across religions, across faiths. Because what we see is that if past is prologue, that what happens in the years past and the centuries past or the decades past may happen to other individuals now. And spaces and conversations like this are creating the networks, the infrastructure for support to not only reflect or have an academic discussion about how are the impacts of anti-Semitism, of exclusion, of xenophobia and hate impacted our societies and our communities in the past, but how it is, it's like at the throbbing center of the debate right now in our country. And how conversations like this are not only spreading hope, but are equipping ourselves with networks to be able to move forward and ensure that what happened to Salmon when he came into St. Louis does not happen to the individuals that are trying to come to our shores for refuge, for support, and for the acknowledgement that they are human too. And how do we stand against the dehumanizing nature of a discourse that lessens and that separates? In a time where we see more and more people are claiming to be stateless, that they have governments that are persecuting them, it is important that these dialogues and these conversations continue. And briefly, Union Seminary also has a legacy of resistance, but also of embodied solidarity, and we are proud to share an affiliation with Jewish Theological Seminary as well. We're by Morningside House community, and there's a lot of interfaith dialogue that happens there. But there was a theologian named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer actually was at Union for postdoctoral work. And he was a German theologian that criticized Hitler and that established what was called the Confessional Church. A church that was with German theologians that were standing in solidarity and opposing the state's actions against those that were otherized in those spaces. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer had come to Union Seminary, and he couldn't stay here in New York City because his heart, his spirit, and he felt called to go back and to ensure that the German state had at least a prick of conscience from one of its top theologians. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer gave his life and was murdered by the German state. But in one of his books called Letters and Papers from Prison, right before he was going to be executed, he outlined strategies and a three-part plan on how to spiritually, civically, and faithfully resist actions of a state that are trying to demonize and otherize individuals. And those three laws, or those three prongs, are very applicable to what we see today. First, he said, that any action that the state takes that diminishes the character of another must be called for, and that you are in your spiritual right to call out the state in that time. After seeing, in his view and his theological perspective, that all children are children of God, and that the state should acknowledge the divinity and the sanctity of every life, that as citizens of a state that is attacking others, you must stand up against your state. In this situation, the German state, as a German, and say that these actions are wrong. And after doing that, we see that the second part was that we must bandage the wounds of those that are trampled under the will of the state. That we must bandage the wounds of those that are impacted and damaged by the state. And as we see here, a lot of people are hurting throughout the world because of actions that their states or their governments are taking. Whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Honduras, whether it's anywhere throughout the world, there are communities that remember, there are communities that have a legacy of not only suffering, but of resilience, that can't stand in embodied solidarity, and not only put their thoughts on the line, but put their bodies on the line in order to secure and acknowledge the divinity and the sacredness of every human being. And third and lastly, the last prescription, the one that cost him his life, he stated that, and when these tactics do not work, then one must put a spoke in the wheel of the very state and break that wheel. And it's interesting because we're having a conversation right now in our country and throughout the world on how do we stop and how do we slow down and how do we kind of put a halt to the grinding wheels of a state that is continuing to militarize their actions against people. And thankfully, as we saw, and we hopefully still live in a democracy, that our activism, our voting, and that we still have that tool at our hands, and that is something that we could do to ensure that although we may be different, come from different ideologies, different skin colors, different religions, different traditions, that there is a community that remembers, that embedded in our, and in your, and in our DNA as humans, we understand that what is just must be pursued, and that what is unjust must be challenged. So I am encouraged to see this happening today, especially in the time that we're living in, and that we can think together on ways on how we can, through democratic means and through civic aims, put a spoke in the wheel of the system, so that as we see outside in the amazing display that we see Syrian refugees trying to arrive here, how we can ensure that individuals that we know, in every single place there are individuals that are not doing the right thing. There may be respectable disagreements about policies, about political ideology, but one thing that cannot be denied is that every single human being, whether they have a state or don't have a state, or whether they're not supported or they're supported by their governments, they have dignity and sanctity too. And in my experience, especially at City Hall, seeing how this work, this community, and your efforts have elevated the dignity and sanctity of every human being, I am hoping from the bottom of my heart that these conversations continue and that we are able to remember the legacies of those that have suffered, those that have fought, and those that have given their lives so that we have the right to stand up for others as well and embody solidarity. So I am thankful and honored for the invitation to be here, and I'm looking forward to any dialogue that will ensue. Thank you.
So thank you, Jonathan, for reminding us of the plight of immigrants and refugees today, and of our not just responsibility to stand up, but some techniques and philosophy behind resistance. I'd like to spend a few minutes to take a few questions. I know we're running a little over time, but if anyone has a question, I think it would be great if we could extend this dialogue. And then I will tell you about an action project that you can actually take as you're waiting for food online. There's actually an action project set up outside as well. But first questions, yeah.
To the last speaker, I have a question for you. You know, this is the anniversary of Kristallnacht, and I feel that you came here to make a political speech. So my question to you is, when was the last time that you spoke out for the Jewish community, the way you're speaking out for this political climate that we're in? When was the last time you spoke up for the injustices in Israel and to the Jews all over the world? If you could tell me where you spoke up for us, I will listen to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that question. And when I said I mean like democracy.
Yeah.
So in no way, shape, or form was I talking about party.
You were talking about the refugee situation.
Absolutely.
Right now, okay, let's put it on the table.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the theme of the talk tonight is refugees, young refugees, now and then. So we invited him to speak about any comparisons between, we had 3 child refugees in the room. We have Brenda and Arthur and Egon. And how does that compare to child refugees today? So we invited him to make that comparison.
And I appreciate the question, and I apologize if it was in no way, shape, or form was that considered to minimize the plight. And I think going back to the point of embodied solidarity, to acknowledge that the traditions and the strength of the Jewish community, especially when we were at the mayor's office, being able to stand up against the wrath of anti-Semitism that happened throughout the city, ensuring that we were there time and time again, personal liaison between synagogues and the NYPD, to ensure that everyone felt safe, especially when anti-Semitism rises. We see that there are threats happening everywhere. So we ensured always a close liaison with the NYPD every single time, and ensuring that after we saw the tragedy in the Tree of Life Synagogue, we were many different areas with many different vigils, many different spaces, but also liaising to ensure that there's funding for security at synagogues throughout New York City. So that is absolutely something that we do and that we have worked very hard to do. And it's tough to talk about these topics because usually we see that unfortunately it cannot be separated from the zeitgeist or the kind of elements of the moment where states are acting. And that's why the embodied solidarity and the traditions of my faith are personally informed by the resilience of the Jewish people. So I thank you for your question, and in no way, shape, or form did I mean the democracy as the party, but democracy as the idea that we could resist here in this country in peace, and understand that there are folks that are also suffering the same plight in a different way. And I thank you for your question, and thank you for expressing it honestly.
Thank you. Do any of the students, would any of you like to ask a question? Maybe just while we're waiting, Lori, you could just tell us about the project that you set up outside.
Sure. I actually have a comment too. I wanted to thank you both. And I wanted to say quite to the contrary, that your remarks did not at all minimize the suffering of the Jewish people or anyone, but you made me feel very proud for the tradition, and we should remember the tradition is to help the stranger. It's much, much easier to help someone that looks like you and sounds like you, but our responsibility is to help the stranger, so I want to thank you very much. And both of you. I just wanted to let people know, unfortunately, I got stuck in traffic. We were going to do this before, but there's a small action you could take that will be very significant in someone's life. And that is a project that was started by some women in Arkansas called Letters of Hope for Syria. And they collect letters every month, just cards that say very simple wishes for safety and hope. This has been going on in various schools. So we invite people, we'll have a table with markers and paper, just to take a moment out to write a note that will be delivered to some of the children that are stuck inside Syria. This will be delivered to them. There are photographs on the Facebook page if you want to look at them, Letters of Hope Syria, of children receiving them. It's, you know, it's a tiny, it's not even a drop in the bucket of what we would like to do, but if it gives one moment of comfort to one child, then you've done something well. So I invite people to please stop by the table.
Is there anyone else who would like to make a comment or ask a question?
Yeah, I don't know if we have time, but I'd like to ask Jane about her hidden story.
Oh, I was not.
Oh, that's what it sounded like. I'm sorry.
No, I was not. New York Magazine asked me to write an article, and I'll just tell you in a quick minute. The few hidden children who were looking for publicity for a gathering they were planning were so ambivalent. They were so used to hiding that even though they were in their 50s then, They were working out of a borrowed apartment with no phone. They wouldn't tell me their right names. Their query to New York Magazine was so unprofessional that the editor threw it in the trash, and luckily his secretary rescued it and gave it to another editor who assigned it to me.
Arnold?
I'm somewhat perplexed as to how to deal and view the situation. I've been involved with groups at the JCC where we've been discussing this for now months. And here's what my problem is. Anti-Semitism, the way I defined it, is the irrational hatred of Jews. In other words, they weren't hurt or killed because they stole money or they beat somebody up or they did something that was horrible. And there was no place for us to go. I'm a Holocaust survivor. Because no one would take us in, the same as Mr. Salmon described. Now, there are now refugees in the world that we're talking about in many, many, many millions, perhaps a billion people. America, the United States, is not large enough to absorb all those immigrants. On the other hand, we are a compassionate people, and we have to deal with the situation. The problem really is, and I don't know the answer, is how to do this. Like, for example, I have a lot of relatives in Israel who would like to come to America, but they can't come because they can't get visas. So if we are a nation of laws, so we allow people to come in illegally. However, once they're here, we have to deal with them. We have children, we have women. It's horrible. So it's a perpetual problem, and we have to deal with them. But I don't want to mix it up with anti-Semitism, because it is different.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else have any comments or questions? Thank you for reminding us again about the rising tide of anti-Semitism in this country and some other important national issues. Rabbi Sussman?
No, well, I think we're at a kind of a bad time. And what happened in Pittsburgh, I think, was our Jewish 9/11, if you would call it that. And the question is what to do. And so, you know, we're trying. Some of us are getting together Monday night at 7:30 at Temple Emmanuel, with people from many different community states, ethnic groups, to exchange ideas to how to teach respect and of others, of each other, and also what we do about protecting ourselves, and just to kind of strategize. So if anybody's interested in coming back to that, that's November 12th at 7:30 at Emmanuel. And we're doing it, the one who's kind of leading the charge is Reverend Troy, who was just here a few minutes ago.
Thank you. I don't know, Jonathan, did you want to respond to Arnold's comments, or maybe Arthur will speak? And
I want to make a comment. I'm a Holocaust survivor. When I survived the war, I went back to Poland with my father. I was liberated in Hungary, but I'm from Poland. After the war, we went to look who survived. Out of a family of 300, 2 cousins survived. That was it. That's not it. That's not all. When I came back to Krakow, Poland, we arrived on a Thursday, and Saturday I was in the synagogue with my father when rocks started to fall through the windows. Within a few minutes, a priest and a Polish officer walked into the synagogue accusing the congregation that they've seen a boy coming into a synagogue that hasn't come out. Within minutes, a pogrom started. 4 Jews were killed after the war in Krakow, which is not a small city. We had to go into hiding. We hid for 4 days till it quieted down, and then we had to hightail back to Budapest. Not only that, we had no place where to go. I grew up in Poland. I grew up in Krakow. But I couldn't stay there. Nobody would accept me. Not only that, we were stateless. We couldn't come to America. We couldn't go to Israel. We couldn't go anywhere. I had to get smuggled into Western Germany to be in a DP camp for 3 solid years, useless years. Till I finally, in 1949, we were allowed in to come to the States. And that's not just me. There were hundreds of DP camps all over Germany. And that's where we stayed for solid 3 years. Then finally, in 1949, it was eased, and we were able to come here. I don't know what the answer is. I know what I went through, what others go through. You tell me.
Thank you. I think we should continue this conversation over the reception. I don't know if you have a very brief response or if you want to wait and...
Yeah, just briefly. It is not a comparison. No one can ever claim to have suffered the way the Jewish community has. But I do think it's a touchstone of hope for others that are at threat or at risk, to understand that it is possible to survive. And that dialogue, which is what America produces, the ability to dialogue and to learn from each other, I think that's the valuable place. And we may disagree or even debate the degree to which how those debates happen, but in a spirit of reverence and understanding the sanctity of that experience, it becomes a place of hope and ways for other communities to think about this situation. And it is not an easy conversation, which is why I think it's important to have it. Instead of running away from the third rail, instead of grabbing it. So I do appreciate the comments, and in no way, shape, or form equating, but understanding that it is a source of, I think, of warning, but also of how can other communities appreciate, but also learn in the struggles that they're going through. But thank you very much for those comments.
So we just have a final speaker. That Egon Salmon himself is going to say a few remarks, and then we will close out the evening. Eyewitness to anti-Semitism.
We have full house. I thank you for attending the 3rd annual Egon Salmon and Family Commemoration of Kristallnacht and the St. Louis. In order to be reunited with our father, who was at the concentration camp in Dachau for 6 weeks, and then was told to leave the country We were passengers on the St. Louis to be reunited. We were lucky to survive. There's no set rule as far as anti-Semitism is concerned. You have to have hope for the best. I want to take this opportunity to thank everybody that came here to see the problems, some of the problems which occurred in my lifetime. Marie and I endowed this annual lecture so that the story will be continued to be told as a reminder of history and a lesson taught to our Jews and future generations. I'm happy to learn that the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, officially apologized in Ottawa yesterday for the 1939 decision to turn away the St. Louis. Carin German Jews looking for refuge in Canada after Cuba and the United States turned them away. I am disappointed. It has taken Canada 79 years to recognize what they did, and this acknowledgement does not bring back those that perished. It stands as a reminder that every country must deal with refugees fleeing persecution with knowledge, not bigotry. The Staten Island Advance, under the direction of Carl and Diamond Harrison and Brian Lalam, in coordination with Professor Lori Weintrob, tracks educating our community, especially our Jews, on the Holocaust. Thank you very much. I also want to thank you, Sherry Stoll, for production of a video which was superb. The other Staten Island Holocaust survivors or stories you have brought to life, communicating their recollection and experiences, and hope that they won't be repeated. My experience is unique. I don't recommend it. Thank you, Jane Marks Hart and Jonathan Soto, for your presentation, focusing on young refugees' voices then and now. We must learn and never forget. Thank you, Carin, Guarasci, Dr. Victor Avis, and the entire High Society for your leadership and encouragement. I extend my heartfelt appreciation to you, Dr. Weintrob. For all of you have continued to do for Holocaust education and this annual event, thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Egon, and thank you to the audience for your openness to this dialogue. The executive director of Hearth said that they were founded to help rescue Jewish refugees, but their job today now is to help refugees because they're Jewish. And that's something I think that opening up that conversation, while perhaps triggering the tragedy in Pittsburgh, is nonetheless something that we all need to take on for ourselves. So I'm asking all of you to help continue this intergenerational and interfaith dialogue with your support. There's envelopes in the booklets that we gave you, and we hope you will consider adding to the Salmon Endowment so this event may continue to grow and be more and more special every year. Finally, when I spoke to the teacher at Jewish Foundation School about our event tomorrow and asked her what to speak about, she asked that we explicitly address anti-Semitism because since Pittsburgh, her kids are coming to school and middle school every day, terrified to be in a building that's marked as a Jewish institution, even though they're living in Staten Island. So we all have a responsibility to this community, and one way to fight hate is not just to speak to the Jewish community, but open up these conversations to people of all faith. And we're very proud to have had a Kristallnacht event where the two keynote speakers were of other faiths, and we thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. Thank you.